My name is Sloan Mercer, and I am 34 years old, and on a Sunday afternoon in January, my father walked into my kitchen to refill his coffee mug, and he saw a piece of paper sitting on the counter next to my laptop, and he picked it up without asking, the way he picks up everything in my life without asking, and he read it, and I watched his face change from casual curiosity to confusion to something I had never seen before, which was silence, total, unbroken silence, and the paper he was holding was a formal offer letter from a global advertising agency offering me the position of Executive Creative Director at an annual salary of $457,000, plus bonuses, plus equity. And he looked at me and said, "Is this real?" And I said, "Yes, Dad. It's real." And he said, "When did this happen?" And I said, "They offered it to me 6 days ago." And he said, "6 days. And you didn't tell us." And I said, "No, I didn't. Because for the last 12 years, every time I told you anything about my career, you called it a waste of time." And he opened his mouth and nothing came out. And I took the letter from his hand and I said, "You can tell Mom on your way out." Let me take you back to 15 minutes before that moment. Because context matters. And the context is that my father had shown up at my apartment unannounced, which he did sometimes when he wanted to remind me that I wasn't doing life correctly. And this particular Sunday he had come over because my mother had told him I wasn't returning her calls fast enough and he wanted to make sure I was okay, which really meant he wanted to make sure I wasn't making choices he disapproved of. And when I opened the door, he was holding a bag of bagels, like that made the intrusion fine, and he said, "Your mother is worried about you." And I said, "I'm fine, Dad. I've just been busy." And he looked around my apartment, which is small but clean, and said, "Busy with what?" And I said, "Work." And he said, "Right, work." And the way he said work made it sound like I had said napping. My father is a man who spent 40 years as a structural engineer, and he measures success in blueprints and buildings and concrete things you can point to and say, "I made that." And I am a creative director, which means I make ideas, I make campaigns, I make narratives that sell products and shift perceptions. And to my father, that has always been approximately the same as making nothing. And he has spent my entire adult life waiting for me to get serious and do something real, and every time I tried to explain what I actually did, he would nod with a look on his face like he was listening to a child explain a game they invented. I graduated from college with a degree in visual communications, and my father said, "What are you going to do with that?" And I said, "I'm going to work in advertising." And he said, "Doing what?" And I said, "Creating campaigns." And he said, "So you're going to make commercials?" And I said, "Among other things, yes." And he said, "Sloan, that's not a career, that's a gig." And I said, "Dad, some of the highest paid people in marketing are creative directors." And he said, "Maybe in 10 years if you're lucky. But what are you going to do in the meantime?" And I said, "I'm going to start," and I did. I got a job as a junior designer at a mid-sized agency making $38,000 a year, and I worked on car ads and grocery store flyers and social media graphics for brands nobody had heard of, and I stayed late every night because I wanted to be better than good. I wanted to be undeniable. And my father asked me once how much I was making, and when I told him, he said, "Sloan, I made more than that my second year out of school." And I said, "Different industries, Dad," and he said, "Exactly." 3 years in, I got promoted to mid-level designer, and my salary went to $51,000, and I worked on a campaign for a regional healthcare system that won a local advertising award, and I was so proud I called my parents and told them, and my mother said, "That's wonderful, honey." And my father said, "Did it come with a raise?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Then what's the point?" And I stopped calling them with updates after that. When I was 29, I moved to a larger agency in a different city, and I took a senior art director role at $78,000, and I was managing a team of 3, and I was leading campaigns for clients with actual budgets, and I was finally doing work that I was proud of, work that I could see in the world and feel like I had contributed something. And my father came to visit, and he asked what I was working on, and I tried to explain a brand repositioning project for a financial services client. And halfway through, he cut me off and said, "Sloan, do you ever think about going back to school for something more stable?" And I said, "Like what?" And he said, "Business or law, something with a clear path." And I said, "I have a clear path, Dad, I'm on it." And he said, "If you say so." The truth is, I was on a path, but my father couldn't see it, because the path didn't look like his, and he spent years mistaking different for wrong, and I spent years trying to prove to him that my work mattered, and then I stopped trying because I realized he wasn't measuring my success against an objective standard. He was measuring it against his comfort level, and his comfort level required me to have a job he could explain to his friends in one sentence, and creative director wasn't it. Last year, I was recruited by one of the largest agencies in the country They had seen work I did for a consumer tech brand, and they wanted me to come in and lead their creative team for a major retail client. And I flew out for interviews, and I met with their leadership, and they offered me a role as Associate Creative Director at $142,000. And I took it, and I didn't tell my father the title or the salary, because I knew he would find a way to make it smaller, and I was right, because when I mentioned months later that I had changed jobs, he said, "Why do you keep moving around?" And I said, "Because I keep getting better offers." And he said, "Or because you can't stay in one place long enough to build anything," and I let it go because arguing with him was like arguing with weather. 6 months into that role, I got pulled into a pitch for a campaign that would become the biggest thing I'd ever worked on. We were competing against 4 other agencies for a contract with a global sportswear brand, and I led the creative concept. And we won, and the client loved the work so much that when the campaign launched and drove a 22% increase in sales in the first quarter, they called my boss and said, "We want her," and my boss called me into his office and said they want to bring you on as their executive creative director. And I said, "For the client," and he said, "No, Sloan, they want to hire you away from us." And I said, "What?" And he said, "They're going to make you an offer, and it's going to be significant. And I should probably try to counter it, but honestly, I think you should take it." The offer came in writing 3 weeks later, and I sat in my apartment reading it over and over because the number didn't feel real. $457,000 base salary, plus performance bonuses that could add another $100,000, plus equity options and a relocation package. And I had gone from making $38,000 11 years ago to this. And I wanted to call my father and say, "Do you see me now?" But I didn't, because I knew what he would say. He would say, "That's a lot of money, Sloan, but is it stable?" And I would say it's a 3-year contract. And he would say contracts end, and I would hang up feeling smaller than I did before the call. So I didn't call. I just printed the offer letter and I left it on my counter while I decided whether to sign it. That Sunday, my father showed up with his bagels and his unsolicited concern, and he walked into my kitchen and he saw the letter and he picked it up and his whole face rearranged itself and he said, "Is this real?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, $457,000. And I said, "Plus bonuses?" And he said, "Sloan, I don't understand. I thought you were still doing the advertising thing." And I said, "I am doing the advertising thing. Dad, this is what the advertising thing pays when you're good at it." And he said, "But this is more than I made at the peak of my career." And I said, "I know." And he said, "How long have you been making this kind of money?" And I said, "I haven't been. I just got this offer last week." And he sat down at my kitchen table without asking. And he said, "Why didn't you tell me?" And I said, "Because you've spent 12 years telling me my career was a waste of time." And he said, "I never said that." And I said, "Dad, you've said it in 100 different ways." And he looked at the letter again and he said, "I didn't know." And I said, "You didn't ask." We sat there for a long time, and finally he said, "I'm proud of you." And I said, "Are you, or are you just surprised?" And he said, "Both." And I said, "That's not the same thing." And he said, "I know, but I am proud." And I said, "Okay." And I didn't say anything else, because I didn't owe him reassurance. And he stood up and said, "I should tell your mother." And I said, "You should." And he walked to the door, and then he stopped and he said, "Sloan, I'm sorry I didn't see this coming." And I said, "You didn't see it coming because you weren't looking." And he nodded and he left, and I sat in my kitchen and I felt something strange, which was not triumph and not anger, but relief, because I had finally stopped performing for an audience that wasn't watching. I signed the offer 2 days later, and I started the new role 5 weeks after that. And I didn't send my father updates, didn't call him with wins. I just did my job, and I did it well. And 6 months in my work was featured in a case study in a major industry publication, and my father texted me a screenshot of the article and said, "Saw this, someone at my golf club showed it to me," and I wrote back, "Glad you saw it." And he wrote back, "I've been telling people my daughter is an executive at a global firm." And I didn't respond because he wasn't telling people that. When I was making $51,000 and grinding on campaigns, nobody noticed he was telling people I needed to get serious. The thing about validation from people who spent years withholding it is that when it finally comes, it doesn't feel like a gift. It feels like they're catching up to information you already had about yourself. And my father spent over a decade believing I was wandering. And the moment he saw a number that made sense to him, he decided I had arrived, but I had been arriving the whole time. He just wasn't in the room. I see my parents a few times a year, and my father introduces me now as his daughter, the creative executive, and he says it with a kind of pride that I don't trust, because it's tied to a salary, not to the work, and the work is what mattered. The work is what I built when he wasn't watching. And the salary is just the world's way of confirming what I already knew, which is that I was good at something he never understood. If you've spent years building a career that the people closest to you didn't respect, if you've had a parent or a partner or a friend tell you that what you do isn't real work and then act shocked. When the world pays you like it is, I need you to hear this. Their doubt was never about your capability. It was about their comprehension, and you don't need them to understand what you do. You need them to trust that you know what you're doing. And if they can't do that, then their pride when it finally shows up doesn't mean you've proven yourself. It means they've finally admitted they were wrong and you don't owe them forgiveness. For that, you just owe yourself the truth, which is that you were right the whole time.